Hi everyone, it's John. Happy Tuesday. I think it was last week that Peg from the History Shelf did her version of the finance book tag that was originally done by David Murphy in mid-March, I think, back when the world was normal. Um, she tagged me, and unfortunately, I have a few answers that are not so original, derivative, you might say. One or two which I piggyback a little bit on Peg, and maybe a couple of original answers. So, without any further ado, I'll just get started with number one. No more 30-minute tags. Number one, diversification is the averaging out of independent risks in a large portfolio. Hold up a few books we wouldn't expect to find on your shelves. Okay, so I think it was a couple of months ago where I posted to my Instagram page that I am a perfume collector and I love perfume and wear it on a regular cologne, whatever you want to call it. Wear it on a regular basis, and love the history of it and all of that good stuff. So here's just one thing. If you did not know that about me, you might be surprised to find something like this on my shelf. It is a big fat book of, 600 plus pages of perfume reviews called Perfumes, the A to Z Guide by Luca Turin and his wife Tanya Sanchez, who are, Luca Turin is probably best known for being not only a perfume reviewer, but being a neurologist who studies the olfactory sense. So he studies how scent works and how your brain perceives it on a very cellular and molecular level, which is fascinating. That's not what this book is about. This is just his sometimes very witty and succinct reviews, maybe just a few lines. Other times he waxes poetic and can write a whole page on a particular perfume. But they are reviews by him and his wife, Tanya Sanchez. I got this as a Christmas present for myself several years ago, and since a new version has come out. Something else you may not necessarily expect to find on my shelf, because I don't think I've ever mentioned my inclination towards these, are textbooks, and not just your average U.S. history textbook or your average biology textbook or whatever else, but textbooks on subjects that are a bit maybe not first year course material, so something a bit more advanced in a subject that I've always wanted to learn more about. So I have an introductory biology textbook, for example, but whenever I pick up a textbook, whenever I see a text on, say, biology, for example, this one, this is a textbook for probably an advanced undergraduate course in mammalogy. I will just pick it up and over a period of months read it. Now, granted, this is not a terribly long book, 550 pages or so, but the pages are huge and it's textbooks, so it's not like reading a novel or anything. I love just finding out about new things that I might have thought I was only marginally interested in, but end up being fascinated by. And this happens over and over again when I read a textbook. I'll find dozens of things that just endlessly interest me in something that I would have never really thought to read more into. So I might do a separate video one day in which I only talk about these. Okay, past results. Number 2, past results are not indicative of future outcomes. Tell us more about a book or author you disliked or were indifferent about on first reading but gave a second chance to and ended up liking. I'm going to echo Peg here and say that I'm not a big rereader of books, with very few exceptions. I think life is too short and I'm too slow of a reader. I want to discover new things I have a chance of liking instead of revisiting old things I know I have disliked or been indifferent to at least once. So I'm not going to say that I never reread anything that I've disliked before. Nothing came to mind after thinking about it for about 10 or 15 minutes. But I couldn't really think of anything, and like I said, it's not something I do on a regular basis at all. So I don't really have a good answer. Number 3, the effect of earning interest on interest is known as compound interest. Name a book that has aged remarkably well, or a book that gets better each time you read it. Aging remarkably well and getting better each time you read it are probably two definitions or parts of the definition of what you would call a great book, with a capital G and a capital B. Hopefully those books that really stick out in your mind, at least to you, they may not be canonically great, but if they are a great book to you, they probably withstand the test of time and get better and better each time you read them. For me, a few examples of those would be, and I don't have the copies here to show you because they're either in boxes somewhere or not readily accessible in this room. Middlemarch, Villette, and Jane Eyre are 3 that come immediately to mind. And then I started thinking more widely, and I thought pretty much any 19th century novel by a brilliant woman is going to get better and better with time. Number 4, a firm's current ratio is the ratio of current assets to current liabilities. So a ratio of 1 means current assets are equal to current liabilities. If current assets are the books in your library you have read and current liabilities are the books you have not read, is your current ratio above, below, or equal to 1? And of course it has to be, can't be 0. It can be close to 0, but it can't be 0. Mine's probably closer to 0, definitely closer to 0 than to 1. I did some quick calculations with Goodreads, which is very much incomplete, along with some other things in this room and in another part of the house where I also have many other books. And I'm thinking it's somewhere around 800. Oh, I'm sorry, around 0.25, the ratio, because I calculated that I have around 800 read and around 3,200 unread, which sounds painful when I say it out loud because that's way too many books to own and not have read. But when you take 800 and you divide it by 3,200, you get 0.25. So 0.25 is my current ratio. Number 5. Familiarity bias is the tendency of investors to favor investments in companies they are familiar with. What is a book you go to out of familiarity? And I'm not a big rereader, even of books that I really, really love. Like I said, I mentioned Middlemarch, Jane Eyre, Villette, books like that. I have read those at most 3 or 4 times. When I was a kid, and when I mean a kid, I was probably 12, maybe 11, something like that. Probably the only 11-year-old boy in the state of Texas who was ranting and raving over all of the Anne of Green Gables novels. Absolutely loved them, read them from cover to cover, maybe 5 or 6 times. All, oh, I think I just had the first 8, but I think there was something like 12 or 13, if I'm not mistaken. Lucy Maud Montgomery wrote them starting back around World War One, and then wrote them through the 1930s or 40s. So there were a lot of them, and I thought of course, the first one is probably the best, but I was really a fan of just seeing her grow up in front of the page, right in front of you, from her orphanhood to an adult woman, and it was really my first exposure to a character whose story lasted for more than a single book. I was never really a fan of science fiction. I'm not really sure if huge, long series were all the rage that they are now, but that is one of the great series of books that's been around for a long time, and that I really, really loved in early middle school, something like that. Number 6, investors are always seeking alpha. That is, seeking a non-zero difference between a stock's expected return and its required return. What is an underrated book, or a book that should be more well known but isn't? Okay, so I'm going to slightly reinterpret this question, and I have 2 writers who should be more well known but aren't. Okay, so this is not necessarily books that are their best, but the writers as a whole, I think, should be much more read than they are. This first one, in his own day, he's an American. In his own day, he was the bee's knees, as they say. Was very popular, and was kind of surprised to find him in a modern library classics edition, because today you hear absolutely nothing about him. And he is William Dean Howells, who was perhaps one of the most popular American novelists of the last third of the 19th century. This is his novel called A Hazard of Fortunes. I think the the Library of America has either 2 or 3 of these things, of his novels. This just happens to have, I've not read this, obviously, the cellophane is still on it, but this has his novels from 1875 to 1886. It includes A Foregone Conclusion, A Modern Instance, Indian Summer, and perhaps his most famous novel, which is The Rise of Silas Lapham. Last year, I think, certainly last year, I reviewed one novel by this writer, who I think is also criminally underread and underrated. She was rediscovered in the 1980s when Gore Vidal published an essay about her in the New York Review of Books. But for many years after her death in, I think, the early 1960s, and even now, she's kind of fallen into desuetude, I guess, again. And her name is Dawn Powell. This just happens to be one book that I found online, former library copy. This is Turn Magic Wheel. She wrote sort of 2 distinct groups of novels. She had a very depressing childhood, and she wrote a few novels early on, I think, about growing up very poor in the isolated Midwest. And then at some point in her life, she moved to New York City. and from then on she started writing these really scathing satires about literary society and the people that inhabited it in New York City in the 30s and 40s and 50s. And they are funny. They're dry. They're witty. They're something I think everyone needs to try out if you like really smart, scabrous humor. Don Powell. A derivative, number 7. A derivative is a security, the payoff of which depends solely on the prices of other marketed assets. Tell us about a book you thought was derivative. Okay, so I'm not quite sure how the financial definition of derivative is related to the way that we colloquially use the word derivative as an adjective. But I still came up with an answer. I think so. Okay, so Peg talked about history, and she said something pretty astute, I thought, which is, at least as far as history is concerned, pretty much anything that you read is going to be derivative, and I will just cast a net. I will cast that net of an argument over not just history, but everything. If author X, for example, comes out with a novel next week, he has or she has written a novel which is a literary form that has been around for about 4 centuries. It's kind of hard to claim that you're writing anything that is totally original when you're writing a novel. Now, if you have certain kinds of characters or plot development, or you're writing about certain issues that may not have ever been written about before, you can have original elements within your novel, but the novel is still a completely unoriginal literary form. And the same thing, poetry is how many thousands of years old? I don't know. It's older than writing, probably. And literary criticism, probably nearly as old. When you really start to talk about genres, a lot of it is intertextual copying from one another, right? And we like to think it's original, but it might not be. It might be a lot easier to actually think about some of the authors that we might start to think of as truly original and not derivative, because I think that might be easier to that might be a much shorter list. Certainly would be a shorter list. So, granted, Shakespeare is a playwright, and the pursuit of being a playwright in drama is much, much older than Shakespeare. But I would say that there's a lot in Shakespeare that makes him truly original. I would say the Greek tragedians, Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides, maybe are some of the first original playwrights to ever write in the form. I'm not sure if drama ever existed anywhere else before this. Let me know if you know. But before, 4th or 5th century Greece, it probably did somewhere in the world, but I don't know if they were acted out by human beings on a stage with an audience. And then in the field of history, maybe Herodotus and Thucydides might count as original, but of course, they had their textual precursors and probably their genre precursors as well. But we do think of them as the founders of the act of historic or historiography. So Certainly the list of original people, I think, is much more fun to think about than the list of derivative people, because 99% of what you would see in any given bookstore when you walk in it is derivative. Number 8. A share repurchase is when a company uses cash to buy back its own stock. Tell us about a book you own too many copies of. Okay, so I own at least 3 copies. I only have 2 to show you, but at least 3 copies of this little The Basic Writings of Martin Heidegger, 10 Key Essays, with an introduction. I promise you I'm not flicking you off. With the introduction to Being and Time, Sein und Zeit. When I was an undergraduate, one of my majors was philosophy. I loved it. These are, despite Heidegger's very unapproachable and dense writing style, these are relatively short essays, maybe, 25, 35 pages apiece, that can be understood with relative ease if you have maybe a helping hand. And I was lucky enough to have that in undergrad school. I had someone to go and ask questions to. So I come back to those, and I've often flirted with the idea of reading these one at a time, not doing a book review on the whole book, but reading them one at a time and posting sort of a video discussion on each essay. Because the essays in here include The Origin of the Work of Art, The Letter on Humanism, Was ist Metaphysik, What is Metaphysics? There's the essay on Modern Science, Metaphysics, and Mathematics. So each essay has more than enough to do a 20 or 30-minute talk on, if in the very remote chance you would ever be interested in something like that. Leave me a comment below, and I will see what I can do. See if I can shed some light, if such a thing is possible, on Heidegger. And last but not least, I didn't get to copy the actual question, but it was something about show us some books that your parents gave you. And my dad never really gave me any that I can remember. He showed me a history club book once and let me buy a copy of a biography of Maimonides. I remember that. Most of the books that are bought from me were bought by my mother, and she has a vague sense of what I like, but I'll start off with something she bought me a long, long time ago that I just discovered a couple of hours ago while I was preparing these books and pulling them off the shelf, that they have beautiful little pictures in them. So this is an edition of, you can see it, Great American Poets. It's Frost. There you go. And it has these lovely little pictures. They're not pictures, they're oil paintings, but to accompany each one of the poems, it has, Acquainted with the Night and Two Paths and other, Stopping by Woods on a Snowy Evening. It has all of the famous Frost poems in it. She must have bought this for me 25 years ago or so. And then just a month or two ago, she ended up bringing this home from the thrift store. Usually I ask her to take a picture of it for me, but she saw it and thought I would be immediately interested. It is Leave It to My Mom to Pick Up Something by Robert K. Massey. This is the Romanovs, the final chapter. I have to say I love Robert K. Massey, but the Romanovs especially don't grasp my attention. I think they can be a little bit, they're so popular that sometimes they're manipulated by popular historians. Not to say that Robert K. Massey would do something like that on purpose, but I'm much more interested in his books about, for example, Catherine the Great and Peter the Great, those big, whopping 800, 900 page biographies that he wrote, than I am this. But I will probably eventually read this, nevertheless. And that's 26 minutes instead of 30, so that's what we call progress. I will see you guys and gals next Tuesday with maybe a review or maybe 10 more new books, because my goodness, I certainly have them to show. I will see you next week. Bye.